There's a truth that very few people know. The first civilization on this earth was not built from stone, it was not built from gold, it was not built by the hands of gods or the strength of giants. It was built from mud, wet mud, river clay. Mud pulled up from the banks of two great rivers, shaped by human hands, dried beneath a merciless sun, and stacked brick by brick into something the world had never seen before. And yet, that civilization scared the world, not with armies at first, not with weapons forged from iron or bronze. It scared the world with something far more dangerous. It scared the world with the idea that human beings could organize themselves, that they could build walls around their lives, that they could write down laws and force other men to follow them, that they could look up at the sky, name every star, and decide which god owned which piece of heaven. Sumeria did not just give us civilization. Sumeria gave us the template for power itself, and that is something history has never fully reckoned with. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the world around you grow quiet. Imagine a darkness so complete that there are no cities in it, no roads, no borders drawn across any map, because no map has ever been made. The year is somewhere around 4,000 years before the birth of Christ. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers lies flat and wide and almost impossibly still. The air smells of water and salt and something ancient, something that has no name in any modern language. This is Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. And somewhere in the southern reaches of this land, in a place the Greeks would one day call Sumer, something is beginning to happen, something slow, something quiet, something that will change every single human life that comes after it. People are gathering, not in the way that animals gather, driven by instinct and hunger. These people are gathering with intention. They are choosing to stay in one place, to stop following the herds, to stop walking with the seasons. They are planting seeds in the soft, dark earth beside the river, and they are waiting for those seeds to grow. And while they wait, they are building. At first, the structures are small, humble, little more than walls of mud brick surrounding a central space. But over time, those walls grow taller. The central space becomes something more than a meeting place. It becomes a temple, a house for the gods that these people believe live in the sky above them, in the rushing water beside them, in the storm that rolls in from the west without warning. What history often overlooks is that the first great buildings ever constructed by human hands were not palaces, they were not fortresses, they were temples. The very first act of organized human civilization was an act of worship, or perhaps an act of fear, because the gods of Sumer were not gentle gods. They were not the distant philosophical gods of later civilizations. They were immediate. They were demanding. They flooded the rivers without warning, drowning entire harvests in a single night. They sent disease through the reed marshes, silent and invisible and terrifyingly efficient. They withheld rain for months at a time, turning the rich dark soil to dust and cracked earth. And the people who lived beneath their sky had one overwhelming, consuming question that shaped every moment of their lives. What do the gods want from us? The answer that the priests of Sumer gave was everything. The gods wanted labor, they wanted grain, they wanted blood and oil and the finest cloth. They wanted ziggurats, those great step towers of mud brick rising up from the flat plain like man made mountains, so that the divine could descend from heaven and find a worthy place to rest. And so the people built, season after season, generation after generation. They built not because they were forced to at first, but because they believed. Because the alternative, a life without the protection of the gods, was too terrifying to contemplate. And in that act of collective belief, in that shared organized terror, the first city was born, Uruk. The name itself carries a weight that most of us have never been taught to feel. Uruk was not simply a settlement. By around 3500 BCE, it had become something the world had genuinely never seen. A city of perhaps 40 to 80,000 people, surrounded by walls that stretched for 9 kilometers, built of fired brick and standing tall against a horizon that had until then known only open sky. It had temples, it had workshops, it had specialized craftsmen, merchants, administrators, priests, and something entirely new in human history. It had bureaucrats. Few people know that the earliest writing in human history was not poetry. It was not prayer. It was not the record of a great king's deeds, carved in stone for eternity. The very first written documents ever discovered, those small clay tablets pressed with a pointed reed and dried in the Sumerian sun, were receipts, accounting records, lists of grain received and grain distributed, numbers of sheep, quantities of beer, the names of workers and the rations they were owed. The first thing humanity chose to write down was a transaction. And in that moment, something fundamental shifted in the nature of human power. Because writing did not just record the world, writing controlled it. A man who could not read had no way to dispute what the tablet said. A farmer who handed over his grain and received no written record had no proof, no recourse, no voice within the system that had grown up around him. The written word became the instrument of authority, and authority in Sumer was absolute. And on that morning, in some room in Uruk that we will never be able to fully imagine, someone pressed a reed into wet clay and made a mark that meant, "This belongs to the temple." And with that mark, civilization took its first step towards something that would echo through every empire, every government, every system of law and taxation and control that the human world has ever known. Power had found its language. The city of Uruk grew, and as it grew, something else grew with it, something that had perhaps always lived inside human nature, but had never before had the space or the structure to fully express itself. Hierarchy, the understanding that some people stood above others, that some lives were worth more than other lives, that the man who could read the tablet, who could speak to the god, who could command the labor of 1,000 other men, occupied a different category of existence entirely. At the top of that hierarchy stood a figure that Sumerian civilization invented and the whole world eventually imitated. A figure so powerful, so removed from ordinary human experience, that the people who lived beneath his rule could barely conceive of him as a man at all. This is the king. But in Sumer, the king was not simply a king. He was something more. He was the intermediary between the human world and the divine one. He was the man chosen by the gods themselves, selected from among all living people to serve as their representative on earth. His word was law not because he was strong, though he was strong, not because he was wise, though wisdom was expected of him. His word was law because the gods had spoken his name, but because the divine will had descended from heaven and settled on his shoulders like a garment of light. And the name that Sumerian civilization gave to this sacred quality of kingship was a word that has no perfect translation in any modern language. They called it kingship from heaven. The belief that legitimate rule was not a human invention, but a divine gift, sent down from the sky, held by one man at a time, and capable, under the right circumstances, of being taken away. In that room, power changed forever, because when you tell a people that their king rules by divine right, you do not simply give that king authority over their bodies. You give him authority over their souls. You make rebellion not just dangerous, but sinful. You make obedience not just prudent, but holy. And you create a system so self reinforcing, so deeply woven into the fabric of belief and fear and daily life that it can persist for centuries, even millennia, without anyone ever truly questioning it. This was the gift and the curse of Sumeria. This was the thing that scared the world, not its walls, not its armies, not its ziggurats rising against the desert sky. What scared the world, say, was the idea, the organizing principle, the quiet, devastating insight that human beings could be made to surrender their freedom willingly, if only you could convince them that the gods required it. The rivers flowed on, the clay dried in the sun, and the first civilization in human history settled into its power, as sure of itself as the stars it had named, as permanent as the mud it was built from. None of them knew how fragile it would all turn out to be. There is something that the history books rarely pause long enough to tell you. Sumeria did not rise in silence, it rose in noise, in the grinding of stone against grain, in the low, constant sound of thousands of human beings working beside a river that never stopped moving, in the chanting of priests at the top of ziggurats so tall that the men below could no longer make out the words, in the scratch of reed against wet clay, hour after hour, in the lamplit rooms where the first scribes in human history bent over their tablets and pressed meaning into mud. Civilization, it turns out, is not a quiet thing. It is loud, it is relentless, it is hungry. And Sumeria, the first civilization the world had ever produced, was perhaps the hungriest of all. To understand what Sumeria became, you must first understand what it was built upon. Not just geographically, though geography matters enormously here. The land between the Tigris and the Euphrates was in many ways a paradox. It was extraordinarily fertile. The annual flooding of the rivers deposited rich silt across the plain, making the soil dark and generous and capable of producing harvests that could feed tens of thousands of people. But that same land had almost nothing else. No timber, no stone suitable for building, no metal ore buried in the earth beneath the flat, featureless plain. Everything that Sumeria needed to grow beyond its mud brick walls had to come from somewhere else. And that single fact, that desperate, driving need for resources that the land itself could not provide, became the engine of everything that followed. It pushed the Sumerians outward. It turned them into traders, first, and then into something more. It gave them a reason to look beyond the horizon and ask what lay there. And in doing so, it gave them something that would define civilization for the next 5,000 years. It gave them ambition. The trade networks that Sumer built were, for their time, almost incomprehensibly vast. Cedar wood came down from the mountains of Lebanon, carried overland and by river across distances that would have seemed impossible to any earlier generation of human beings. Copper came from the mountains of what is now Iran and Turkey. Lapis lazuli, that deep and extraordinary blue stone that the Sumerians prized above almost everything else, traveled from the mines of Afghanistan along routes that crossed some of the harshest terrain on Earth. What history often overlooks is the organizational genius required to make any of this happen. To move goods across that kind of distance, you needed more than willing traders. You needed contracts. You needed standardized weights and measures so that both parties in an exchange could trust that they were receiving what they had been promised. You needed a system of credit because not every transaction could be settled immediately in grain or silver. You needed law, and so Sumer gave the world something else, something that we live inside of every single day without ever stopping to consider where it came from. The concept of enforceable agreement between human beings. Before Sumer, a promise was just a promise. It depended entirely on the character of the person who made it, on the social bonds between two individuals, when on the threat of personal violence or communal shame if the promise was broken. But in Sumer, for the first time in human history, a promise could be written down. It could be witnessed. It could be pressed into clay and sealed and stored in a temple archive, where it would outlast the memory of everyone involved and stand as permanent, unalterable record of what had been agreed. Few people know that some of the oldest legal documents ever discovered are Sumerian loan agreements, contracts between merchants and temples, between individual citizens and the city's administrative apparatus, recording debts that were expected to be repaid with interest. The concept of interest itself, of money breeding money, of a debt growing over time like a living thing, was a Sumerian invention. And like so many Sumerian inventions, it was simultaneously a marvel of organizational thinking and the source of enormous human suffering. Because debt in Sumeria had consequences that we would find almost unimaginable today. A man who could not repay what he owed could lose his land. He could lose his home. He could lose his freedom. Debt slavery was a recognized institution in Sumerian society, and the records from the great cities of Ur and Lagash and Nippur contain case after case of ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen and small merchants, sliding from independence into bondage because a harvest failed, or a trade venture went wrong, or the interest on a loan compounded beyond any possibility of repayment. On that morning, when the first debt was written into clay, no one in that room understood what they had created. They thought they were solving a problem. They thought they were making commerce more reliable, more trustworthy, more fair. And in many ways, they were right. But they were also building, without knowing it, one of the most durable mechanisms of human inequality that the world has ever known. Power in Sumeria was not just divine, it was also financial, and the two were more closely connected than most people realize. The temples of Sumer were not simply places of worship, they were economic institutions of staggering complexity. The great temple complex of Inanna at Uruk, or the temple of Enlil at Nippur, controlled vast tracts of agricultural land. They employed thousands of workers. They ran workshops that produced textiles, pottery, metalwork, and beer. They stored grain in quantities sufficient to feed entire cities through years of drought or flood, and they lent that grain out at interest to farmers who needed seed for the next planting season. The gods of Sumer, it turned out, were excellent bankers, and the priests who served those gods occupied a position of power that was almost impossible to challenge because they controlled something even more fundamental than land or money. They controlled access to the divine. They were the ones who could read the signs in the sky, in the movements of the planets, in the patterns of smoke rising from a sacrificial fire. They were the ones who could tell a king whether the omens favored war or counseled patience. They were the ones who stood between ordinary human beings and the terrifying, incomprehensible will of the gods. In that room where the priests gathered each morning before the great statue of the god they served, power was renewed and consolidated with every ritual, every chant, every carefully orchestrated act of devotion. The ordinary people who brought their offerings to the temple gates had no way of knowing exactly what happened inside those walls, and that ignorance was not accidental, it was designed. Mystery was a tool of governance, just as law was, just as debt was, just as the written word was. Sumeria was, in this sense, the first civilization to fully understand something that every powerful institution since has known and used: that the most effective form of control is the kind that the controlled cannot see, that people who believe they are acting freely out of devotion and duty and love of their gods are easier to govern than people who know they are being compelled. But even within this carefully constructed system of divine authority and economic dependency, something was always shifting, always moving beneath the surface. Because Sumeria was not one city, it was many cities. And those cities did not always agree. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Nippur, Eridu, Kish. Each of these was a world unto itself. Each had its own patron deity, its own temple complex, its own ruling class, its own army. And between them, stretching across the flat plain of southern Mesopotamia, lay the fields and canals and roads that connected them and the rivalries that divided them. What history often overlooks about the Sumerian city-states is not that they fought each other. Of course they fought each other. Every collection of powerful, ambitious, resource-hungry human communities will eventually come to violence. What is remarkable is how those conflicts were justified, how they were explained to the people who would be asked to fight and die in them. Wars between Sumerian cities were not presented as conflicts between men. They were presented as conflicts between gods. When the city of Lagash went to war with the city of Umma over a disputed stretch of agricultural land, the people of Lagash were not told that their king wanted more territory. They were told that the god Ningirsu had been wronged, that the boundary set by the great god Enlil at the beginning of time had been violated by the impious men of Umma, that to fight was not merely a political act, but a sacred one. The soldiers who marched out through the gates of Lagash that morning carried their weapons and their fear and their loyalty to a king they believed had been chosen by heaven. And somewhere on the flat plain between the two cities, beside a canal that had no name in any language that survives to us now, they met the soldiers of Umma, who believed exactly the same things about their own god and their own king and their own divine cause. And the world's first recorded war between organized states began, not in glory, not in silence, but in the ordinary terrible way that all wars begin, with men who did not choose to be there, standing in a line, waiting for the order that would send them forward. None of them knew, as they stood there beneath that ancient sky, that what they were doing would still be echoing 5,000 years later. There is a name that history has almost forgotten. Not the name of a king, though kings will come into this story soon enough. Not the name of a god, though the gods of Sumer were as real to the people who worshipped them as anything we hold sacred today. It is the name of a woman who lived approximately 4,300 years ago in the city of Ur, in the southern reaches of the land between the rivers, a woman who held a title that had never existed before her, and who used that title to do something that no human being had ever attempted. She wrote about her own soul. Her name was Enheduanna, and few people know that she was the first named author in all of human history, not the first person to write. Writing had existed in Sumer for centuries before her birth, but she was the first person whose name was attached to a written work and preserved across time, the first individual human voice that reaches us out of the ancient darkness, speaking not in receipts or accounting records or legal contracts, but in poetry, in prayer, in the language of longing and terror and devotion. She was the daughter of Sargon of Akkad, and her father was perhaps the most consequential man who had ever lived up to that point in human history. To understand Enheduanna, you must first understand Sargon, and to understand Sargon, you must understand what Sumeria looked like in the centuries before he arrived, because the world that Sargon shattered was not a world in crisis. It was a world that had, in many ways, achieved something remarkable. The city-states of Sumer had developed over centuries of conflict and negotiation and cultural exchange, a kind of rough equilibrium. No single city dominated all the others for very long. Power moved between them, sometimes through warfare, sometimes through dynastic marriage, sometimes through the slow accumulation of trade wealth and religious prestige. The great city of Kish held something called the Lugal, a title meaning roughly great man or king, that conferred a kind of symbolic supremacy over all the other city-states. But this was not an empire. It was more like an acknowledgement, a recognition that one city, at any given moment, sat at the top of a shifting and always contested hierarchy. What history often overlooks is that this system, for all its violence and instability, contained within it a genuine kind of pluralism. The gods of each city were different. The laws of each city were different. The artistic traditions, the architectural styles, the calendars, even the dialects of the Sumerian language, varied from one city to the next. Mesopotamia in the early 3rd millennium. BCE was not one civilization moving in one direction. It was many civilizations pressing against each other, borrowing from each other, fighting each other, and in doing so, generating a creative energy that produced some of the most extraordinary achievements in human history. And then Sargon came. He appeared, as world-changing figures so often do, from somewhere unexpected. He was not Sumerian. He spoke Akkadian, a Semitic language entirely different from the language of the great cities to the south. His origins were and remain genuinely obscure. Later legends described him as the son of a humble woman who placed him in a basket of reeds and set him adrift on the river, where he was found and raised by a man who tended gardens. Whether this story is literally true or whether it was constructed after the fact to give divine narrative shape to a life that needed no embellishment, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is what he did. Around the 2334 BCE, Sargon of Akkad began a campaign of conquest that would, within his own lifetime, bring every major city of Mesopotamia under his control. One by one, the great city-states fell. Uruk, Lagesh, Nippur, Kish itself, the city that had long claimed symbolic supremacy over all others. Each of them, with their proud traditions and their ancient gods and their centuries of accumulated power, submitted to this man from the north who spoke a different language and worshipped under different names. On that morning, when the walls of the last resistant city were breached, and Sargon stood for the first time as the ruler of a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the mountains of what is now Syria in the north, something entirely new had come into existence in the world. An empire, not a city, not a collection of rival cities held an uneasy balance. A single political entity governed from a single center, answering to a single authority. The world's first empire, and with it came something else, something that would prove just as significant as the military conquest itself. The world's first imperial administration. Sargon understood, with a clarity that suggests either genius or very good counsel, that conquering cities was the easier part. Holding them was harder. Governing them, extracting their wealth, preventing rebellion, maintaining loyalty across distances that messengers took weeks to cross, all of this required something more than military force. It required bureaucracy. It required the placement of loyal administrators in conquered cities. It required standardized weights and measures imposed uniformly across the entire empire so that taxes could be calculated and collected consistently. It required a common language of governance, and Akkadian, Sargon's own tongue, gradually became that language, spreading across Mesopotamia, not through any single decree, but through the slow, inexorable pressure of administrative necessity. And it required, perhaps most importantly of all, something that every empire since has instinctively understood. It required a story, a narrative that explained why this new order was not simply the victory of one strong man over many weaker ones, but the fulfillment of divine will, the manifestation of cosmic order in human political reality. This is where Enheduanna enters the story. Sargon appointed his daughter as the high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur and of the sky god An at Uruk. This was not merely a religious appointment, it was a political act of extraordinary sophistication. By placing his own daughter at the head of the most important religious institutions in the conquered Sumerian cities, Sargon accomplished something that no army could achieve on its own. He wove his family, his bloodline, his Akkadian identity into the very fabric of Sumerian religious life. He made the divine apparatus of the conquered cities serve the political purposes of the conqueror. But Enheduanna was not simply a tool of her father's ambition. She was something far more complicated and far more interesting. She wrote, with a voice so distinctive, so emotionally raw, and intellectually sophisticated that her hymns to the goddess Inanna stand today as some of the most remarkable literary documents ever produced by a human being. In one of her most famous works, known today as the Exaltation of Inanna, she described her own suffering, her exile from the city of Ur during a period of political upheaval, her desperate prayer to the goddess she served, and her eventual restoration to her position. Few people know that in those lines, pressed into clay tablets in a city that no longer exists, so the entire tradition of personal religious literature, the tradition of speaking to God not as a community performing ritual, but as an individual pouring out the contents of a human heart, begins. Every psalm, every personal prayer, every poem of spiritual longing and divine petition that has been written in any language, in any culture, across the last 4,000 years, carries somewhere within it the echo of an Hiduana's voice. In that room, late at night, by the light of an oil lamp whose flame bent in some unfelt current of air, she pressed her words into wet clay and gave something to the world that the world did not yet know it needed. She gave it the individual. Because before Enheduanna, the written record of Sumer was almost entirely collective. It recorded what groups of people did, what cities decided, what gods demanded, what kings commanded. The inner life of a single human being, the texture of personal suffering and private devotion and individual spiritual experience, had no place in the written world. It had no language. It had no form. And Hiduana gave it both. And in doing so, she revealed something about the civilization that had produced her, something that the clay tablets of accounts and the stone inscriptions of military victories had not, could not show. She revealed that beneath the extraordinary organizational achievement of Sumerian civilization, beneath the temples and the ziggurats and the trade networks and the legal codes, there were human beings. Frightened, longing, spiritually hungry human beings who looked up at the same sky their gods were said to inhabit and felt as every human being in every age has felt, profoundly and sometimes unbearably alone. Sumeria had built the architecture of civilization, but Enheduanna built something harder to see and more difficult to destroy. She built the architecture of the inner life, and the empire her father created, vast and unprecedented and terrible in its power, would not outlast the words she pressed into clay on those quiet nights in Ur. Because empires, as Sumer was already beginning to learn, are made of force, and force, however great, is always temporary. But a voice, a true voice, speaking from the center of a human soul, that is something else entirely. There is a question that the ruins of Sumer seem to ask of anyone who stands among them long enough to listen, not a question about dates or dynasties, or the sequence of kings whose names are recorded on the ancient lists that Sumerian scribes compiled with such meticulous care. Those questions have answers, partial and uncertain as they sometimes are. The question that the ruins ask is something deeper, something that has no clean answer in any academic text or archaeological report. It is a question that rises up from the cracked earth and the buried foundations and the scattered fragments of clay tablet that still surface after all these millennia from the soil of southern Iraq. Why does everything that rises eventually fall? Sargon's empire, the world's first empire, the Akkadian empire that had stretched from the Persian Gulf to the mountains of the north, and had seemed in its moment of greatest power as permanent and inevitable as the rivers that fed it. had lasted approximately 180 years. In the long sweep of human history, that is not nothing, but it is far less than the men who built it believed it would be, far less than the inscriptions they carved into stone, boasting of divine favor and eternal dominion, would suggest. The collapse, when it came, did not come only from outside. It did not come only from the armies of rival peoples pressing in from the mountains and the desert margins. It came, as the collapse of great powers so often does, from within, from the accumulated weight of contradictions that no system of governance, however sophisticated, can hold in balance forever. Sargon had built his empire on military genius and administrative innovation, but he had not solved the fundamental problem of legitimate authority. The Sumerian cities he had conquered had submitted to his power, but they had never fully accepted the right of an Akkadian king to rule over them. The gods of Ur were not the gods of Akkad. The traditions of Lagash were not the traditions of the north. Beneath the surface of imperial unity, the old identities, the old loyalties, the old resentments continued to pulse with a life that no amount of bureaucratic standardization could extinguish. His successors struggled, some of them struggled brilliantly. His grandson, Naram-Sin, declared himself a god, the first Mesopotamian king to do so, pressing his own divinity into the official record as if the claim, written down and repeated often enough, could make itself true. He won great military victories. He extended the empire's reach. He built temples and inscribed his conquests on stone stelae that were meant to stand forever. What history often overlooks about Naram-Sin is not his victories, but the text that was written about him long after his death. A text known today as the Curse of Akkad, in which later Sumerian writers described how Naram-Sin had committed a terrible act of impiety, desecrating the temple of Enlil at Nippur in his arrogance, and how the gods had responded by sending a people from the mountains, the Gutians, wild and savage and beyond the reach of civilization, to tear the empire apart. Whether this narrative is historically accurate in its details matters less than what it reveals about how the Sumerians understood power and its limits. They believed, with a consistency that runs through almost every text they left behind, that human greatness was always conditional, that the gods gave kingship and the gods could take it away, that the moment a ruler forgot his place in the divine order, the moment he reached too far, claimed too much, crossed the invisible line between legitimate authority and impious arrogance, the forces of destruction would be sent against him. This was not simply theology. It was political wisdom, accumulated over centuries of watching empires rise and fall on the flat plain between the rivers. It was the observation encoded in religious language, because religious language was the only language available for such fundamental truths that power without humility is always temporary, that the leader who believes himself beyond accountability has already begun his descent. On that morning when the Gutians came down from their mountains and the soldiers of Akkad could not hold the borders that Sargon had bled to establish, the first empire in human history began its final chapter, and the cities of Sumer, those proud and ancient centers of civilization that had submitted to Akkadian rule, watched the empire fracture with something that was probably not simple satisfaction, because the chaos that followed the empire's collapse was not liberation. It was disorder. It was the sudden absence of the administrative structures that had, whatever their injustices, kept trade flowing and roads passable and the complex irrigation systems that fed millions of people functioning. Freedom, in Sumer as in every age, turned out to be more complicated than it looked from inside a cage. But Sumer was not finished, not even close. From the wreckage of the Akkadian Empire, something extraordinary happened. The Sumerian cities, particularly the city of Ur, reasserted themselves. Around 2112 BCE, a king named Ur-Nammu founded what historians now call the third dynasty of Ur, and under his rule and the rules of his successors, Sumer experienced what many scholars consider its greatest cultural flowering. The cities were rebuilt, the trade networks were reestablished, the temples were restored and expanded, and Ur-Nammu did something that would echo across the entire subsequent history of human civilization. He wrote down the law. Few people know that the law code of Ur-Nammu, discovered on clay tablets and dated to approximately 2100 BCE, is the oldest surviving law code in human history. It predates the much more famous Code of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. And unlike later legal codes, which are often lists of punishments, the prologue to Ur-Nammu's code begins not with threats, but with aspirations. It describes a king who has driven away the wicked and the violent, who has established equity in the land, who has made the orphan not fall prey to the wealthy, and the widow not fall prey to the powerful. In that room where Ur-Nammu's scribes assembled the laws of the land into written form, something profound was being attempted. Not just the regulation of behavior, though that was certainly part of it. Something more ambitious. The attempt to use the written word to bind not just the powerless, but power itself. To say that even a king ruled within a framework of obligation, of responsibility, of something that we might, and carefully and with all appropriate historical caution, call justice. Whether Ur-Nammu's Sumer actually achieved justice is a different question. The records suggest a society still deeply stratified, still dependent on the labor of people who had very little choice about how that labor was organized or compensated. The temples still controlled vast resources. Debt slavery still existed. The gap between the lives of the powerful and the lives of the ordinary was still immense by any modern standard. But the aspiration, the written, public, permanent aspiration towards something better than raw power, that was new. That mattered. That would travel forward through time in ways that no one in Ur-Nammu's court could have imagined. The third dynasty of Ur also gave the world something else. Something that speaks to the Sumerian genius for organization in a way that even the ziggurats and the law codes cannot quite match. It gave the world the bureaucratic state in its most fully developed ancient form. The administrative records from this period are staggering in their detail and their ambition. Tax records, labor records, agricultural output calculations covering thousands of fields across hundreds of kilometers. The movements of goods and workers tracked with a precision that would not be matched anywhere in the world for thousands of years. What history often overlooks is the human cost of this administrative perfection. Behind every neat column of numbers on those clay tablets were real people, farmers who worked assigned plots of land and delivered assigned quantities of grain to assigned temple storehouses. weavers, but mostly women, who sat in large institutional workshops producing textiles according to specifications set by administrators they would never meet, at a pace determined not by the rhythm of their own bodies, but by the production targets of a state that saw their labor as a resource to be optimized. Sumeria, in its greatest moment, was simultaneously its most organized and its most controlled. The same system that built the ziggurats and wrote the law codes and compiled the astronomical observations that would eventually become the foundation of modern science also extracted the last measure of human energy from people who had very little power to refuse. This is the truth that sits at the center of Sumerian civilization, and perhaps at the center of all civilization. That the achievements we celebrate and the suffering we prefer not to examine are not separate things. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. The ziggurat and the weaving workshop are built from the same logic, sustained by the same system, justified by the same theology. None of the weavers in those workshops left us their names. None of them pressed their private thoughts into clay and sent them forward across the centuries. Their labor is in the record only as numbers, only as quantities of cloth produced and rations of barley received in exchange. But they were there, in that room, every morning, for the length of lives that the tablets do not bother to record, and the civilization that could not exist without them never fully acknowledged them at all. There is a moment in the life of every great civilization when it begins to sense, however dimly, however reluctantly, its own mortality. Not in the way that individual human beings sense death with the sudden cold clarity of illness or injury or the slow accumulation of years. Civilizations do not have that kind of self awareness. They cannot look in a mirror and see the lines deepening around their eyes. What they have instead are the small, accumulating signs that something fundamental is shifting. Signs that the people living through them often cannot read clearly because they are too close to see the whole shape of what is happening around them. Sumer, in the final centuries of its existence, was surrounded by those signs. The climate was changing. This is not a metaphor. Around 2200 BCE, a prolonged and severe drought descended on the ancient Near East, lasting approximately 300 years and affecting an area that stretched from the Mediterranean coast to the mountains of Central Asia. The rains that the people of Mesopotamia had always been able to count on, however unreliable, however brutal in their fluctuations, became even less reliable. The harvests grew thinner. The rivers, still flowing but carrying less water than they once had, could not fully compensate for what the sky was withholding. The great administrative system that the third dynasty of Ur had constructed with such extraordinary precision was in many ways a machine built for abundance. It could optimize, it could redistribute, it could track and calculate and reallocate with a sophistication that the ancient world had never seen. But it could not make rain fall from a sky that had decided to withhold it. And when the harvest numbers that the scribes dutifully recorded in their clay tablets began to fall year after year below the minimums that the system needed to function, the machine began to strain. Few people know that among the most haunting documents ever recovered from the ruins of Sumerian civilization are a series of lamentations. Not personal lamentations, like those of an Hedwana reaching across the centuries with the weight of individual grief. These are communal lamentations, poems of collective mourning, written by scribes who watched their cities destroyed, their temples burned, their people scattered, and who tried, in the only language they had, to make sense of what was happening to them. Shows the lament for the destruction of Ur is perhaps the most devastating of these texts. Written sometime after 2004 BCE, when the city of Ur was sacked by the Elamites from the mountains to the east, it describes in language of almost unbearable beauty and sorrow the fall of a city that had believed itself divinely protected. It describes the goddess Ningal pleading with the great gods, An and Enlil, to spare her city. It describes those gods refusing, deciding, for reasons that the poem does not fully explain, and perhaps cannot explain, that the time of Ur had come to its end. On that morning, when the gates of Ur finally gave way, and the soldiers of Elam moved through the streets of the oldest and greatest city in the world, something more than a city was ending. The scribes who survived, who fled with whatever tablets they could carry, who eventually settled in other cities and continued their work as best they could, must have felt something that we have no adequate word for. The collapse not just of a political order, but of an entire way of understanding the world. The discovery that the gods they had served so faithfully, whose temples they had maintained with such meticulous devotion, whose will they had organized their entire civilization around interpreting and obeying, had not, in the end, protected them. What does a person do with that knowledge? What does a civilization do when the theological framework that has sustained it for 2,000 years is contradicted by the simple, brutal fact of its own destruction? The Sumerians did what human beings have always done in the face of the inexplicable. They reinterpreted. So they looked at the catastrophe that had fallen upon them, and they found, within their existing framework of belief, a way to make it mean something other than the simple failure of their gods. The destruction of Ur was not evidence that the gods were powerless or indifferent. It was evidence that Ur had sinned, that something, some act of impiety, some failure of devotion, some invisible transgression against the divine order, had caused the gods to withdraw their protection. This interpretive move, this transformation of catastrophe into moral lesson, is one of the most consequential intellectual acts in human history, because it preserved the theological framework intact at the cost of placing the blame for disaster squarely on the shoulders of the people who suffered it. It said, in effect, that the victims of destruction deserved their fate, that the gods were just, and therefore human suffering must always be, at some level, earned. This idea would travel. It would travel far beyond Sumer, far beyond Mesopotamia, far beyond the ancient world. It would become embedded in religious traditions that would shape the moral imagination of billions of human beings across thousands of years. The idea that suffering is punishment, that catastrophe is judgment, that the proper response to disaster is not rage against the forces that caused it, but examination of one's own failures and a renewed commitment to righteousness. In that room where the scribes of Sumer composed their lamentations, they were doing something they could not fully understand. They were building the theological vocabulary that half the world would eventually inherit. But Sumer was not yet finished with its gifts, to the future, even in its decline, even as the political structures that had organized Mesopotamian life for 2 millennia crumbled and reformed and crumbled again. The cultural achievements of Sumerian civilization continued to propagate outward. The cuneiform writing system spread to languages and cultures that had nothing to do with Sumer. The Akkadians had already adopted it. The Babylonians would refine it further. The Assyrians would use it to record their own conquests and their own literary traditions. The Hittites in Anatolia would write their laws and their treaties in cuneiform. Even the Persians, who would eventually build the largest empire the ancient world had ever seen, they would use a version of the writing system that had first been pressed into clay by Sumerian accountants keeping track of grain. What history often overlooks is that the spread of cuneiform was not simply the spread of a technology. It was the spread of a way of thinking, of organizing knowledge, of believing that the world could be recorded, analyzed, and understood through the systematic application of human intelligence, that the movements of the stars followed patterns that could be charted, that legal relationships between human beings could be expressed in precise, written form, that the past was worth preserving, and that the future could be shaped by what the present chose to remember. These are not small ideas. These are perhaps the foundational ideas of what we call rational civilization. And they were born in Sumer, in the minds of people who believed they were doing the will of their gods, without any awareness that they were simultaneously doing something that would outlast every god they worshipped by thousands of years. The city of Ur fell. The city of Nippur fell. The great administrative apparatus of the Third Dynasty crumbled under the combined pressure of climatic disaster and the military incursions of peoples from the surrounding regions, the Amorites from the west, the Elamites from the east, pressing in from every direction against a system that had once seemed impregnable. And then, around 1750 BCE, a Babylonian king named Hammurabi completed what Sargon had begun so many centuries before. He unified Mesopotamia under a single rule. He issued his famous law code, so building directly on the Sumerian legal tradition that Ur-Nammu had established 3 centuries earlier. He made Babylon the center of a new empire, and in doing so, he effectively ended the political independence of the Sumerian cities forever. But something stranger than political conquest happened in those final centuries of Sumerian existence. The language itself began to die, not suddenly, not through any single act of suppression. Akkadian had been the language of administration and commerce for centuries already, spreading gradually across Mesopotamia the way powerful languages always spread, not through force alone, but through utility, through the simple fact that speaking the dominant language opens doors that remain closed to those who speak only their own. Sumerian retreated. It became the language of the temple, of the school, of scholarship and religious ritual. Parents stopped teaching it to their children as a living tongue. It became, in effect, what Latin would become in medieval Europe, a sacred language, a language of learning, preserved by specialists and used in contexts that ordinary daily life no longer required it for. And then, slowly, across generations that had no awareness of what they were losing, even those specialists began to disappear. The last known text, written in the Sumerian language, dates to somewhere around the first century of the Common Era, 2,000 years after the fall of Uruk, 2,000 years of gradual retreat, of narrowing usage, of a living tongue becoming a scholarly artifact, becoming silence. On that morning when the last scribe who could read and write Sumerian died, because somewhere in the ruins of a civilization that the world had long since moved past and largely forgotten, a voice that had spoken for 3,000 years finally went quiet. The rivers flowed on, the mud dried in the sun, and the world that Sumer had made continued without remembering, or perhaps without being willing to acknowledge where it had come from. There is something that happens when you sit long enough with the story of Sumer. The noise of the present world grows quieter. The urgent, insistent demands of the day begin to loosen their grip. And in that quietness, something very old and very true begins to make itself felt, not as an idea, not as a historical argument, but as a recognition, a sense of having always known something that you had simply never found the words for until now. We are not the first people to build something extraordinary and believe it would last forever. We are not the first people to organize our lives around systems of power and belief so complete, so self evident, so woven into the fabric of daily existence that the possibility of their absence was genuinely unimaginable. We are not the first people to stand at the height of our civilization's achievement and feel, however briefly, however falsely, that we had solved the fundamental problems of human life. Sumer felt all of this. In the temples of Uruk, in the counting houses of Ur, in the schools where young scribes bent over their clay tablets and pressed the accumulated knowledge of their civilization into the soft earth of the river valley. They felt the certainty that what they had built was permanent, that the gods who had guided them were reliable, that the walls around their cities were sufficient, that the words pressed into clay would always find someone capable of reading them. None of it lasted in the way they believed it would, and yet, here is the truth that sits quietly at the very center of this story, patient as the river, enduring as the clay. It lasted anyway, not the walls, not the temples, not the political structures, or the divine kingships, or the carefully maintained irrigation systems that fed millions of people across the flat plain between the rivers. Those are gone, dissolved back into the earth from which they were made, leaving behind only fragments, only traces, only the faint impressions in dried mud that archaeologists carefully brush away the dust from, century after century, trying to hear what those impressions are saying. What lasted was the thinking, the organizing, the reaching, the fundamental human insistence that the world could be understood, recorded, shaped, and passed forward to people who had not yet been born. The belief that a single human voice, pressing its words into whatever medium was available, could cross distances of time so vast that the mind cannot fully hold them. And Heduana pressed her grief and her devotion into clay 4,300 years ago, and her words still exist, still speak, still carry, across that impossible distance, the weight of a human soul trying to make sense of a world that did not always make sense in return. That is what Sumer gave us. Not just civilization, not just writing and law and mathematics and astronomy and all the technical achievements that the textbooks carefully list. It gave us the proof that the human impulse to reach beyond the present moment, to say, I was here, To say this is what I understood, to say I am sending this forward into a future I will never see, is not futile. It is perhaps the most essentially human thing of all. The rivers still flow between their ancient banks, though the cities that rose beside them are dust. The stars that the Sumerian astronomers named and charted still move in the patterns they observed and recorded, and somewhere in the deep structure of every legal system, every written contract, every act of organized human governance, every personal prayer spoken in any language to any god in any corner of the world, the echo of Sumer continues, quiet, patient, enduring, as the river endures, as the clay endures, as the voice of the first civilization, pressed into the soft earth of the world's first morning, endures long after the last lamp goes out.